Hi, I'm Sean Gannon, and this is Minute Math, and today we're learning about quadratic equations with square roots.
Minute Math, when you need help you use Minute Math.
We're given this problem right here, k squared plus 6 equals 6, and we want to solve this by taking the square root. Well, first thing I want to do is I'm going to go try to get k squared by itself. So I'm going to subtract a 6 to both sides, and we're left with, well, k squared equals 6 minus 6 is 0. Then from there, we need to take the square root of both sides here. Okay? K is now by itself equals, and we take a square root over the equal sign, we need to put a plus and minus. And the square root of 0 is just, well, 0. So what does that leave me? Do we have a positive and negative 0? No. K just equals 0, and that's it. Our final answer is pretty simple. It's just k equals 0. We're given this problem right here. 25v squared equals 1, and we have to solve this. Well, what I want to do first is I want to get v squared by itself. So I'm going to divide both sides by 25. I'm now left with a v squared equals 1 over 25. Well, now we want to, how do we get rid of the squared? Get rid of squared, we take a square root. So I take a square root of both sides of the equation. This gets me v by itself is equal to, now when we take the square root over an equal sign, we have to have plus or minus, okay? And when we take the square root of a fraction, we can really take a square root of the numerator and the denominator individually. Square root of 1 over the square root of 25. Let's simplify that up here. V equals, it's a plus or minus still. Well, square root of 1 is, 1. The square root of 25 is 5. And so we have v equals plus or minus 5. We can write it like this. V equals a positive 1/5, or plus or minus 1/5. So v equals a positive 1/5, and v equals a negative 1/5. And so that's our final answer. V equals a positive 1/5 and a negative 1/5. We're given this problem right here. N squared plus 4 equals 40, and we have to solve this by taking some square roots. Well, my goal here is to get n squared by itself. So I subtract a 4 to both sides, and I have n squared now is equal to 40 minus 4, 36. Now, to get rid of the square, I have to take the square root of both sides of the equation. N is now by itself, and when we take a square root over an equation, we have to make it a plus or minus. Now, the square root of 36 is pretty easy, and that is 6. So we kind of have n by itself here equals a plus minus 6, which really means n can, not n, but m, the letter n equals a positive 6 and a negative 6, and that's our final answer. We're given this problem right here. X squared minus 2 equals 17, and we have to solve this equation by taking square roots. I want to get x by itself. I want to add a 2 to both sides. That leaves me with x squared here equals 17 plus 2, which is 19. I now, to get rid of the squared, take a square root of both sides. Take a square root, and x is now by itself, and it's equal to, again, square root over an equal sign, plus or minus, and then square root of 19 actually doesn't break down to be anything more simple or simpler. So we take a square root of just 19 here. So what does that mean? Well, we have x equals plus or minus square root of 19. So x can be a positive square root of 19 or a negative square root of 19. And that's our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 9r squared minus 3 equals a negative 152. And we have to solve this equation by taking square roots. First thing I want to do is, I want to add a 3 to both sides. I want to get r by itself here. Adding 3 to both sides gives me a 9r squared equals negative 152 plus 3 is a negative 149. Not too bad. Divide both sides by 9. And now I have r squared by itself. And really, negative 149 divided by 9 doesn't really simplify anymore. So negative 149 over a 9. Bummer. Well, to get rid of the squared, I take a square root of both sides. I square root both sides, and I'll put it up here. And r equals, we take a square root of both sides. we have to do a plus or minus. And we have plus or minus the square root. And the square root can go to the numerator and denominator individually. So the square root of negative 149 over the square root of 9. Well, breaking this down a little more, r equals plus or minus here, we can't take a square root of a negative. So we're going to have an imaginary number here. Okay. Well, the square root of negative 149 is the square root, same thing as the square root of a positive 149 times the square root of a negative 1 over square root of 9. We know that to be 3. Well, what's the square root of negative 1? That's I. So we have r equals plus or minus square root of 149 times I over 3. The square root of 149 actually doesn't break down or simplify anymore. So when we're basically done, but writing this as our final answer here, we don't need to write the plus or minus, let's separate it out. Writing properly, we put an I first, so we have I times the square root of 149 over 3, and then we have to make sure we get the negative version of this. So negative I square root of 149 over 3, and that's it. That is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 9r squared minus 5 equals 607, and we want to solve this equation by taking some square roots. I want to get an r by itself. So I want to add a 5 to both sides. And then we have a 9r squared here equals 607 plus 5 is 612. Divide both sides by 9. And r squared equals, well, 612 divided by 9 comes out to be a 68. So now we have r squared equals 68. Get rid of the squared, take the square root. And so r equals, well, I'll put it up here. R by itself equals a plus or minus the square root of 68. When we take the square root over an equal sign, we need to make sure it's plus or minus. Well, square root of 68 does break down. 68 is 4 times 17. So this is equal to r equals plus or minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 17. And now by doing that, we broke this down into multiplication of two square roots, where we know we can break down the square root of 4. So r equals plus or minus the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 17 actually doesn't break down anymore, so we have to leave it as square root of 17. So now it's in its simplest form, so we can write it out. We have a plus or minus, so we can see it as r equals a positive to square root of 17, and r equals a negative to square root of 17, and that is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. Negative 10 minus 5n squared equals a negative 330, and we need to solve this by taking square roots. So first thing I want to do is I want to try to get n squared, or n really by itself. I'm going to add a 10 to both sides. We're left with a negative 5n squared equals a negative 330 plus 10 is a negative 320. We then can divide both sides by negative 5, and n squared equals negative 320 divided by a negative 5, which is a positive. Negative divided by a negative is a positive 64. Well, n squared equals 64. So to get rid of the square root, take the square root. We have n equals a plus or minus, taking a square root over an equal sign. And the square root of 64 is pretty easy. It's just an 8. So we're pretty much done, and we can write this as one statement like this, or in two parts. Instead of plus or minus an 8, it's n equals a positive 8, and n equals a negative 8, and that's it. That is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 5a squared plus 7 equals a negative 60, and we have to solve this equation by taking square roots. First step, I'm going to subtract a 7 to both sides. Try to get a by itself. So we have 5a squared is equal to, well, negative 60 minus 7 is a negative 67. I then have to divide both sides by 5, and now a squared is by itself, and, well, this is just negative 67 over 5. They don't divide evenly. Well, to get rid of the a squared, I have to take a square root of both sides. And so a equals, well, a plus or minus the square root of negative 67 over 5. Okay, plus or minus is, again, over an equal sign. We have to do that. But where do we go from here? Okay, because this doesn't look nice. Well, a equals plus or minus the square root of the fraction. We take the square root of the numerator, negative 67, over the square root of the denominator, which is 5. Now our rules state we shouldn't have, or it's not proper to have a square root in the denominator. So to get rid of that, I'm going to multiply this by essentially the number 1. But I'm going to make 1 be square root of 5 over 5. Right? Square root of 5 over 5 is really 1, doesn't change it. But what it does do, it allows me to eliminate the square root in the denominator. So, in the numerator, we can multiply that out with inside. And so negative 67 times 5 is square root of negative 355, or 335. Oof, that would have been a mistake. 335 over square root of 5 times square root of 5 is just 5. So now we're good. We don't have the square root in the denominator, but I do have a negative in the square root. So we can break this down, plus or minus. Break this down even more. A equals plus or minus square root of negative 1 times the square root of 335 over, well, 5. And now what's the square root of negative 1? We know is I, imaginary. So a equals plus or minus square root of negative 1 being I times the square root of 335 over 5. So now we actually have it pretty much broken down. It doesn't simplify anymore. So we can write this as, well, two numbers next to each other instead of plus or minus. A equals a positive I, square root of 335 over 5, and a negative I, square root of 335 over 5. And that is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 4b squared plus 2 equals 326. And we need to solve this by taking some square roots. Well, first thing, I'm trying to get b by itself. So to do that, I subtract 2 to both sides. 4b squared is here, and 326 divided by a negative 2, minus a negative 2, is a positive 324. Ooh, dividing would make this problem wrong. Now we have 4b squared equals 324. I divide now both sides by 4, and I have b squared by itself. And 324 divided by 4 is a good old 81. Not too bad. Get rid of the squared with b, take the square root of both sides. B equals a plus or minus, right? Take square root over equal sign, plus or minus. And square root of 81, that's easy, that's 9. So b equals plus or minus 9. We can write this as b is really a positive 9 and a negative 9. This is actually a pretty quick problem. That is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. Negative 8 minus 8p squared equals to negative 31. And we want to solve this by taking square roots. Well, I want to get p by itself. So to do that, I have to add an 8 to both sides. I'm left with a negative 8p squared is equal to a negative 31 plus 8, a negative 23. Now I divide both sides by negative 8. I now have p squared by itself is equal to, and well, a negative divided by a negative is a positive, but this doesn't really simplify anything or anymore. So we have 23 over 8. So now we have p squared. Get rid of p squared, take a square root. Square root of both sides, and p equals a plus or minus the square root of 23 over 8. And remember, taking the square root of over an equal sign, we did the plus or minus. Where do we go from here, though? Well, p equals plus or minus. The square root can go to the numerator and denominator individually. So square root of 23 over the square root of 8. Square root of 8 actually simplifies a little bit. Plus or minus square root of 23 over square root of 8 as well the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. Okay? And then the square root of 23 doesn't simplify anymore. Square root of 4 is just 2. So if p equals plus or minus, well, square root of 23 over 2 times square root of 2. But again, for nice writing, we don't have square roots in the denominator. So how do we get rid of that? Well, we have to multiply it by square root of 2 over the square root of 2. We do that because we know we multiply square root of 2 times square root of 2. we get rid of that square root. And square root of 2 over square root of 2 is equal to 1. It won't change the equation. So p equals plus or minus. All right, we can multiply this out in the numerator. 2 times 23, we can combine that to one big square root, is a 46. So we have the square root of 46 here over square or 2 stays here, and square root of 2 times square root of 2 is just a 2. So p equals plus or minus, pretty easy to simplify now, square root of 46 over 2 times 2, which is 4. So now we can write this as a statement as such. The plus or minus, there's nothing else to simplify, but the plus or minus we can separate. So p equals square root of 46 over 4, and a negative square root of 46 over 4. And that is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 5x squared plus 9 equals 14. And we need to solve this equation by taking square roots. First thing I want to do is subtract a 9 to both sides. You see, we want to get x by itself. So we have 5x squared equals 14 minus 9 is a good old 5. Well, divide 5 to both sides here. And we have x squared equals 5 divided by 5 is just a 1. Not too bad, not too bad. Get rid of the square root, take a square root of both sides. We have x equals, and when we take a square root of both sides, we have to do a plus or minus. And the square root of 1, what's that? That's just 1. So this is a pretty simple problem. Let's write it out here. X is, well, plus or minus means x is a positive 1 and a negative 1. And that is actually it. That is our final answer here. We're given this problem right here. 2x squared minus 2 equals 6. And we need to solve this by taking some square roots. First thing I'm looking at here is I'm going to add a 2 to both sides. Again, the goal is to get x by itself. So 2x squared equals, well, 6 plus 2 is 8. Not too bad. Well, 2 is being multiplied by x squared. Let's divide both sides by 2. Let's get x squared by itself. X squared equals, well, 8 divided by 2 is just 4. So we can rewrite this over here. If we take the square root of both sides, it gets rid of the squared value, right? So square root of both sides get rid of the squared value. We have x equals, well, take over the square root, it's going to be plus or minus the square root of 4. So the square root of 4, that's just 2, right? So x equals plus or minus the square root, oh sorry, not square root, just equals 2. That's square root of 2 equals 2. Come on, Sean. 2. Well, not too bad. Plus or minus 2, we can write this to be x equals a positive 2 and x equals a negative 2. And now we're done. That is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 8r squared minus 17 equals 2,471. And we need to solve this equation by taking square roots. First thing I want to do is, well, I want to get r by itself. So I'm going to add a 17 to both sides. That leaves me with an 8r squared here, and 2,471 plus 17 is 2,488. Again, trying to get r by itself, divide both sides by 8, and r squared equals 2,488 divided by 8, which is a 311. All right. Well, we have a squared here, right? So to get rid of squared, take a square root. Square root both sides, and put it up here. R is now by itself. When we take a square root over an equal sign, it's a plus or minus, and we have square root of 311. All right. Well, this one actually, the square root of 311 can't break down anymore. And so we're pretty much done. We write this as the positive and negative, so r equals a positive 311 and a negative r equals the square root of 311 and a negative 311 and a negative square root of 311. Woof. And anyway, that is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 13p squared minus 3 equals 4,209. And we have to solve this by taking square roots. First thing I want to do is, well, I'm going to add a 3 to both sides. We're trying to get p by itself. We have 13p squared equals 4,209 plus plus 3 is, well, 4,212. Divide both sides by 13, opposite of that multiplication. And p squared is now by itself, and 4,212 divided by 13 is 324. Okay, well, we have p squared. Get rid of p squared, take the square root. Put that up here. P is now by itself, squareds and square roots cancel. And when we take a square root over an equal sign, we have plus or minus. Well, the square root of 324, I didn't know off the top of my head, you might, let me know if you did down below, is 18. So the square root of 324 is 18, and we have plus or minus. Well, that plus or minus being separated out, and so p equals a positive 18 and a negative 18, and that's it. That is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 7p squared plus 16 equals 2,151. We want to solve this equation by taking square roots. I want to get p by itself, so I'm going to subtract a 16 to both sides here. We have 7p squared now equals 2,151 minus 16 is 2,135. Then from here, 7p squared equals 2,135. Let's divide both sides by 7. P squared is now by itself, and 2,135 divided by 7 is a good old 305. All right, p squared equals 305. How do we get rid of the square? We have to take a square root. Hence, this problem. Square root of both sides, let's put it up here. P is now by itself. And when we take the square root of both sides of the equation, we have to do plus or minus. So we have plus or minus square root of 305. Well, I'm going to tell you a little secret here. Square root of 305 doesn't simplify anymore. So we're basically done. We can write this now as, well, two numbers, the positive and negative. So p equals a positive square root of 305, and p equals a negative square root of 305. And that is our final answer. We're given this problem right here. 13 minus 8n squared equals a negative 1,139. And we need to solve this. And we're going to use some square roots. The goal is to get n by itself. So to do that, I have to subtract a 13 to both sides. We're left with a negative 8n squared on the left, and negative 1,139 minus 13 is a negative 1,152. All right, now we have to divide both sides by negative 8. N squared is by itself, and negative divided by negative is a positive, and 1,152 divided by 8, if you know that off the top of your head, put it down below. I didn't, but it's 144. Did you get it? Let me know. Now, n squared equals 144. To get rid of the squared, we have to take a square root. When we take the square root of both sides, all right, you get rid of the n squared here, but we have to have a plus or minus on the right-hand side, plus or minus, because when we take a square root of both sides, plus or minus. Now, the square root of 144 is something I always do off the top of my head, and that is a 12. So n equals plus or minus 12 here, and we're almost done. We can write this as two different numbers, or two separate numbers, right? Positive 12 and a negative 12. And so our final answer here is n equals a positive 12 and a negative 12. I hope you found this video helpful. And if you did, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and like this video. This helps us make more free math lessons for you and for everyone else. So as always, thanks for watching.
Minute Math. When you need help, you use Minute Math.